Hi everyone, welcome. These two bins that you see right here, one above the other, there are a couple worm bins that have red wigglers living in them, and one of them is even my so-called original batch of worms. As I've got the label on there, it's a couple bins that I've been running together as sort of a pair, and it was 12 days ago when we last checked in on these two bins. They're now let's see, what's their ages? Well beyond hundreds. They're in 200s land now. The older is 228 days of age, so that's almost 33 weeks of age, and the other one is 30 weeks of age, 210 days of age. And when I last fed them 12 days ago, they got the last of what had been pulled off of my garden plants, the tomatoes that were still green up on the plant, stuff that would have just frozen because there was a frost on its way, stuff that I pulled off, and a good number of those fruits actually did ripen and were eaten, but all the stuff that didn't was just sitting around anymore, and that's what they got 12 days ago. I'm curious to see how they've done with that last feeding, and I'm assuming that they've done pretty good with it because tomatoes are usually pretty popular. So I've actually come down here prepared to feed them with even more yummy stuff. What I've got for them is just an assortment of fruits and veggies. Got carrots, berries, banana peels. So I'm going to go get a glove on and we're going to get to feeding these guys. So let's get to work. So I thought I'd just pull out the information board here really quick before I get my glove all soiled. Here in the older bin that we're going to feed first, the 228-day-old bin, it's been fed 20 times. This will be feeding number 21. And then once we get around to feeding the original batch of worms, that'll be feeding number 15 for them. And even though there's only 18 days, is that right? 18 days difference between the two systems, there is a significant gap in the number of times these bins have been fed. Not sure exactly why. I'm trying to remember. Maybe one of these bins was used as the time lapse for the cantaloupe recently. That might be the reason for it. I believe that might actually be it. So when I do a time lapse, for a good month, month and a half, whatever the time span it is that the time lapse runs for, the bin is usually, fed regularly in some cases, where the time lapse consists of the system getting regular feedings, but in some time lapses I have just one large feeding applied to the system. And that might have been the reason there was a significant difference in the number of feedings applied to these two systems. Perhaps the original worms were the ones given the cantaloupe melon. Sort of rings a bell. That might be the exact reason. Alright, so that coffee filter that was resting out here in the center was just indicating to us where we last fed. So there would have been a gully sort of dug down into the middle of the bin over here, into which we would have dropped in the tomatoes. Besides the tomatoes, I had taken some leaves, just dry leaves that I gather in the autumn time, but then I mixed in some tea leaves. So it gave those leaves, that leaf assortment, a nice fresh smell to it. And I think there was also some other stuff sprinkled in here too. I think it might have been some pulverized birdseed that was included with the last feeding too. So stuff like that, birdseed, pulverized birdseed is not the sort of thing you're going to expect to see many leftovers of. I smell citrus. I don't remember when we fed citrus to this system, but it does seem to be exhibiting some leftovers. It smells like orange, and this seems to be a chunk of it right here. I guess orange sort of fell off the radar in my mind. I wasn't even thinking of orange in here. This must have been, let's see, yeah, some of the stem even. I guess just took everything. I took everything that was sort of laying there in the collection of tomatoes, including some of the stems, and just threw it all in here. This appears to be the leftover of one of the larger sized ones. I I think there were a few kind of medium, large, not even that large really, just relative to each other, I guess, because some of them were cherry tomatoes. So I guess relative to the size of the cherry tomatoes, sized tomatoes, some of the ones were a little bit larger in size. I'm definitely seeing leftovers of tomato here. Not only stems, but actual tomatoes. And some of these other leftovers, like the orange, and this is a piece of corn cob, those just go back further. So I guess we're seeing some leftovers of the last feeding. We'll just drop them right back down into the feeding zone when we're preparing to drop in today's fresh feeding. Just because I find leftovers, typically I don't feel like I should hold off on applying the food that I had planned for the worms. To me, it just seems like the stuff that's been sitting in the bin for a while and still shows up as leftovers is stuff that they're probably going to be able to get to pretty soon, but they just, for whatever reason, haven't quite been able to yet. And then they'll also be able to nibble on some of the more freshly added stuff. I mean, the frozen banana peels and the frozen carrot peels, those things that they're receiving today, those are things that are probably going to be the types of foods that they can just jump right on and start eating almost immediately once the stuff starts to thaw out here in the bin. And if the tomatoes take a little bit longer for them to get into, so be it. Not a big deal. So what else is in here? I felt something just hit my hand a moment ago. This is just another piece of corn cob, it seems. Usually I don't really try to shatter larger bits of food. I just allow the worms themselves to work it all down eventually over time. So here too is another little stem. All stuff that'll eventually go at its own pace. So let's work on getting them their feeding today. Let's make enough space down here to drop in today's portion. And you know, even though it might look like a pretty good amount, it just doesn't have a whole lot of weight to it. I think a lot of it is just air. A lot of that carrot peel is just air. And, you know, banana peels. There's not really that much food going in from what I could tell, just from the weight of it. So I think we've got ourselves a pretty good size little hole that we can drop in today's feeding into. And yeah, why don't we just proceed with giving them the leftovers first. I'll drop those in on the bottom as sort of a foundation to put the fresh foods on top of. This way at least there will be a little bit of a barrier between the worms and the stuff that they're getting, because this stuff's frozen. And you know, if it's possible to avoid placing frozen stuff directly onto the worms, it's sort of a courtesy thing, I suppose. Not that it's going to injure them or hurt them, I think. Not that it's dangerous as far as I can tell. That's a good bit of carrot. I thought that I had left an equal amount for both bins, so there's 2 more chunks of carrot over there. I'm wondering if maybe a little bit of this can just come back to be placed into the other system, because it does seem like we put a lot of carrot peel in here. I want to be fair and give both systems an equal shake at what they're getting. This is some berries. We'll throw the rest back in here. I think there was some apple peel in here too. Not much, a little bit of apple peel and a banana peel. So let's consider that as a fair split between the two systems, each getting an equal portion of food. Yeah, that looks to me like a pretty nice, generous feeding for these little guys. I believe they're going to enjoy this. Now, some sort of bedding, I suppose, might be nice. You know what? Why don't we throw in some leaves? I replenished my supply of leaves not too long ago. For a while, I just wasn't using leaves much, because I ran out and I just really hadn't had any around. But now that I've got a replenished supply, think we'll get back to giving the wormies the leaves as bedding to go hand in hand with their feeding. So that looks to me like a pretty nice portion for today. We'll begin covering up, and this is usually when I also just keep on going all the way out to the edge so that we give ourselves a peek at how stuff in the outer edges are holding up. When we worked on these two bins over the past few check-ins, one of them seemed to be a little bit overly damp and the other one seemed to be a little bit overly dry. So we were attempting to bring both systems back to a more normal moisture dampness level. And I do believe we're in pretty good shape here from a moisture perspective. Everything in here seems just about right. Everything seems to crumble quite nicely, and everywhere you look there's worms seeming to enjoy the space that they're occupying. So I think from a moisture perspective we're in pretty good shape here. I guess I also like to aerate the material a little bit too when I, come into the bins to feed. So that's also sort of the other thing, besides inspecting the outer reaches of the bin just to make sure everything's okay. It also seems like a nice little opportunity at that time to kind of fluff things up and air things out a little bit. So we're going to be reusing this coffee filter here to show where we last fed. Seems like the worms have really been working it, nibbling away at it, but it's the only one I've got down here right now on the ready to be used as a feeding zone indicator. So a lot of times if I've got a replacement on hand, I'll just use the old one as bedding to go hand in hand with the feeding that they're getting. But here we're just going to be reusing the feeding zone indicators because I don't have replacements on hand right now. So yeah, the system's doing pretty nice, I must say. So let's get the other one out here and see how they're doing. Hopefully just as good. Let's see. It is kind of nice when, you're trying to deal with too damp and too dry conditions in a couple systems, but when you really can't even tell which was which anymore. So hopefully we won't even be able to tell. I couldn't tell if the last system we worked on was the one that had been too damp or too dry. I can't recall. And I don't think I'm really seeing any signs that would tell us if this was the dry or the damp one. It's kind of good when things sort of stabilize to the point where there's really no significant difference like that anymore. So much so that you can't even tell anymore. So here too we've got a pretty heavily worked coffee filter serving the function of feeding zone indicator, and we're going to be reusing that at the end. So I'll just set it aside with those top covering pieces of paper. Yeah, moisture set level seems good. Very similar in both bins. I think last time was when we had sort of came to that judgment call that things had sort of achieved harmony in terms of moisture between the two systems, in terms of one of them had been too damp and the other one having been too dry. So I don't know what this thing was. Maybe just a crumbled up piece of paper? Could have been. Whatever. I guess I sort of broke it up a little bit, and maybe we can spread it out a little bit better now. Although there's fibers floating around in here too, so maybe it was some sort of a veggie. It's very tough to tell. Alright, so same sort of food would have been put into here too. Here I already see some of the leftovers, little bits of tomato. Like this tomato just got nibbled completely empty. It is hollow. It's just the skin remaining. Whereas this one seems to have its internals for the most part. In fact, this one almost doesn't even feel like it's been breached. Because as I press it gently, it feels like it's sort of under pressure and it doesn't really give. I mean, if I were to press it any harder, it would certainly burst, so I don't want to do that. Well, I mean, I could, but I just really do like to watch how the worms make their way through foods without me there to help. Those foods get broken down, and by, you know, breaking stuff, squashing stuff, it seems like that's helping. And my preference is to not help if possible. Sometimes it depends, I guess, you know. So it almost does appear as if these worms did a somewhat better job plowing through that collection of tomatoes, because I don't feel like I'm bumping into quite as many leftovers of the tomatoes as we saw in the other system. Although maybe we just haven't excavated quite thoroughly yet. This looks to me like maybe some leftover asparagus or something. Once again, a leftover of a feeding gone by from further in the past. So, very nice. Yeah, these little guys seem to have... Oh, no, here we go. Now we're starting to bump into some more tomato leftovers. These appear to be somewhat larger tomatoes, a couple of them here. 1, 2. So now it's starting to look like we've got almost an equal amount of leftover tomatoes here with those 2 slightly bigger ones that we just unearthed. So, same story here. We're just going to be giving them today's portion, even though there's a little bit of leftover remaining in here. So let's just make sure we've opened up the hole sufficiently enough to fit all the yummy foods that they're getting today. Okay. I guess one other option would be to just give these little worms a moment or two to be able to just retreat down into the material, and then piling on all the frozen stuff would be perhaps less of an impact on them if they're already down within the bed. Give them a moment. Alrighty, so like we did before, we're going to return all these leftovers down into the feeding area so they can keep at that stuff. And I gotta tell you, I really did almost expect to see virtually no leftovers of the tomato that they got 12 days ago, but, well, you know, there's really not a lot of, I don't know. It almost seems like the worms tend to surprise me. It's like I expect one thing and they almost always produce a somewhat different outcome. Nah, not really. But sometimes they do. Alright, so I think last time we piled some of the bedding material right on top of the freshly added food. Perhaps this time we can sort of lay it in there as a in-between sandwich bedding layer in between the old and the new foods. Let's just hope that we've allowed enough to be able to cover up with at the end here. Yeah, I think once we till up the material from the outer edges, the whole level of everything should rise to the point where we should be able to submerge this feeding area quite thoroughly. So, I think we're almost done here. I guess we can just throw a little bit more of this stuff right on top. What the heck? I'm pretty sure the worms really like the leaves as bedding. So here we got some of the worms that we sort of excavated from the feeding last time. Let's take a quick peek at how things on the outer edges are doing, and then we'll be finished here. Lots of nice castings out here. See a few worms hanging out, but you know, with all that yummy food down the middle, it's not too surprising to find them in the feeding area versus elsewhere. But I don't know, the worms do tend to kind of cruise around and like to hang out in almost all areas of the worm bin. I guess the one telltale of potential not problems or issues, but you know, potential opportunities for improvement is when you find that the material is completely devoid of any worms, meaning maybe it is an opportunity to throw a little bit of moisture in there just to supplement it, but since I found worms throughout the material on both outskirts, I think we're in pretty good shape here. And since we do cover with plastic in these systems, any moisture coming in with the foods that they receive, for the most part, gets shared with the entire system. The moisture just seems to circulate around and around throughout the system. And even though things are obviously much more damp down where the feedings had been applied, that moisture does to a certain point also get shared with the rest of the contents of the bin. So here's the old feeding zone indicator, which might not really be even recognizable next time we come back in here if they keep nibbling on it the way they've been. And back can come the top covering newspaper bits. These two have been getting also quite nicely nibbled, so maybe we'll have to upgrade them with some replacement feeding zone indicators and top coverings when we come back in here next time. And all that remains is our nice plastic covering and our shade cover, and we are finished. So that's it for our Red Wiggler worm bin check-ins. Getting a nice little assortment of delicious foods. These were a lot of their favorites: banana peels, carrot peels. The worms definitely like that stuff for sure. So I think that they're going to like the leaves too, getting mixed in there as well. So it seems like a nice feeding to me. Hopefully they enjoy it. I've got a few things I've got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that, but before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.